Under a cracked, sun-bleached stretch of Texas riverbed, a graveyard of Ice Age giants was waiting to demolish one of American archaeology's oldest assumptions. The Clovis mammoth hunter is a myth. What actually happened at that water's edge was stranger and far more violent. For nearly a century, American archaeology sold the public one clean picture: a hunter, a stone-tipped spear, a mammoth falling in a single throw. Nobody ever checked whether that spear could actually kill an animal that size. Not once, not for 80 years. In 1988, archaeologist Reed Faring stood over a Texas floodplain and realized a construction crew's blade was about to erase 11,000 years of proof before anyone got the chance to read it. He had minutes. What he saved that day is only the beginning of how this story falls apart. That pattern is not a coincidence. It is a habit. Texas keeps its oldest secrets underwater, and every few decades, it runs dry enough to hand them back. In the summer of 1978, the state was locked in one of its worst droughts on record. Rivers thinned to trickles, reservoirs dropped feet at a time, and in a ravine near the Bosque River outside Waco, two men noticed something the shrinking water had left behind. Paul Barron and Eddie Buffkin found a bone so large, it didn't look real. It was a femur, mammoth-sized. The drought had done what decades of survey work never managed. It cracked open a burial ground that had been sealed since the Ice Age. Excavation took years, as gloved hands brushed silt away in thin layers, mapping every bone before it was lifted, because a skeleton's position can say as much as the bone itself. Researchers kept building the shelter bigger because the herd kept getting bigger every season they dug. What they were uncovering wasn't a single animal. It was a mass grave, and mass graves demand an explanation. What came out of that ground eventually became the Waco Mammoth Site, now a National Park Service unit, one of the largest known concentrations of Columbian mammoths anywhere in North America. 24 of them, at least. A whole nursery herd, adults and juveniles together, plus a western camel, buried in the same layer of river silt. Walk through the shelter Baylor University, built over the excavation today, and you'll see their skeletons still locked in the position they died in, tusks curled, ribs stacked, dust drifting under the lights. It looks at first glance like the ultimate proof of the story America has told itself about the first Americans. Big game hunters, spear throwers, people who brought down the largest land animals on the continent and lived because of it. That story has a name in archaeology, and it has shaped textbooks for almost a century. The Clovis culture, named for a stone point first identified near Clovis, New Mexico, distinctive for its fluted base, a groove chipped into the stone so it could be lashed to a wooden shaft. Radiocarbon dating places the Clovis tradition across a tight window, roughly 13,050 to 12,650 years ago. In that short span, this technology spread across nearly the entire continent. And for decades, the working theory was simple. Clovis people survived by hunting mammoths and mastodons, specialized big game killers who followed the herds and speared them at close range. It's the founding image of the peopling of the Americas. Spear in hand, beast in front of them, survival on the line. Texas built that image as much as anywhere. In 1937, in Roberts County in the Texas Panhandle, a researcher named E.H. Sellards excavated a site that would become one of the textbook cases: 5 mammoth skeletons, 3 Clovis points found directly among the bones. It looked like exactly what everyone expected: a kill, a hunt. Proof that this new culture, moving fast across an unfamiliar continent, had mastered the deadliest hunting technique imaginable. Add in nearby Blackwater Draw in New Mexico, just across the state line, and the picture solidifies further. Fluted points near mammoth remains, again and again, enough times that Clovis hunter stopped sounding like a theory and started sounding like a fact. But there was a problem, and it had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, buried under the same Texas dirt that kept handing over the evidence. Waco's mammoths, it turns out, were not killed by anyone. Baylor geologist Lee Nort used optically stimulated luminescence, a technique that measures when buried sediment last saw sunlight, to date the layer those skeletons were buried in. The number that came back wasn't 11,000 years. It was roughly 65,000, decades before Clovis people ever existed. No stone points, no cut marks matching a hunt. The herd had died in a catastrophic flood along the ancient Bosque, swept and drowned in a single event, then sealed by silt for tens of thousands of years. The single most visited mammoth site in Texas, the one that looks like the perfect stage for a Clovis kill, has nothing to do with Clovis hunters at all. It is a flood, not a hunt, and that raises a question that doesn't go away for the rest of this story. If the most famous mammoth graveyard in Texas isn't a kill site, how many others aren't either? The same dry years re-exposed material at another Texas site, Louisville, and its story is its own warning. Excavators there in the 1950s and 60s pulled hearths dated to an astonishing 37,000 years old, a number that would have rewritten the human timeline in North America. It made headlines. It was also wrong. The fuel in those hearths was lignite, ancient coal, burning at a radiocarbon age that had nothing to do with when the fire was lit. Louisville taught archaeology a lesson decades before anyone tested a Clovis point in a lab. Dramatic evidence needs to be checked twice because the ground hands over bones and ash and stone and stays silent about everything else. That silence is where this entire mystery lives. Drought didn't stop being useful to archaeologists in the 20th century. In 2011, one of the worst droughts in Texas history dropped reservoir levels so far that entire drowned landscapes reappeared. Sunken ghost towns resurfaced. Old grave markers came up out of lake beds that hadn't seen sunlight in generations. And in 2022 and 2023, a different kind of Texas drought did something similar 100 miles from the Mammoth sites at Dinosaur Valley State Park on the Paluxy River, where the water dropped so low that tracks pressed into limestone more than 100 million years ago suddenly stood exposed in the dry riverbed. That discovery has nothing to do with Clovis and nothing to do with mammoths. It's a different era, a different animal, a different kind of footprint entirely. But it's the same mechanism at work. Drought doesn't just dry out a river. It turns the riverbed into an open book. And every time Texas bakes hard enough, it hands researchers pages nobody else could read. So here's where the mystery actually starts. Not with whether Clovis people existed near mammoths. They did, repeatedly, provably. The mystery is whether the mammoth hunter behind Clovis was ever the whole truth, or whether it was always a story built out of the sites that survived and preserved cleanly, while the messier, more honest picture stayed buried until the ground finally gave it up. Because the deeper you dig into the sites that made this story famous, the more some of them start looking less like kills and more like something far stranger. Move west from Waco, out onto the high plains near Lubbock, and you find one of the sites archaeologists actually trust as solid evidence. Not because it's flashy, but because it's exhaustively documented. Lubbock Lake Landmark sits along Yellow House Draw, a dry stream channel that has been eroding and re-exposing layers of sediment for most of the last century. Archaeologist Eileen Johnson, working out of Texas Tech, spent decades peeling back those layers, and the site has produced something rare. Nearly 175 radiocarbon dates, giving researchers an almost unbroken record of who lived, hunted, and camped along that draw for over 11,000 years. Stone tools sit directly alongside butchered bison and other megafauna, in sequence, in context, exactly the kind of careful stratified record that lets scientists actually trust an association instead of just hoping for one. Lubbock Lake is one of the strongest pieces of real evidence that Clovis-era people processed large animals with intention, not luck. But even here, the story complicates itself the moment you look closer at what hunting actually left behind. At the Miami site, the one Sellards excavated back in 1937, later reanalysis of the same bones and points forced researchers to admit the original story was too neat. Those 3 Clovis points weren't necessarily kill weapons frozen mid-hunt. Some were resharpened, worn down, and reshaped the way a tool gets reshaped after repeated use, not as a spear tip, but as a knife, a blade used to cut meat off a carcass that was already dead. A later geoarchaeological review of Miami, published in Quaternary Research, laid out 4 separate possibilities for what actually happened there: an active kill, a die-off of already wounded or weakened animals, opportunistic scavenging of a carcass, Clovis people never touched alive, or simply a palimpsest, different visits to the same spot at different times, all mixed together in one layer, looking like one event when it was really several. The textbook kill site that helped build the Clovis hunter myth might not be a kill site at all. It might be something closer to a scene of the crime with no fingerprints left behind. That's Fairing's site, the one from the opening. 2 independent radiocarbon measurements on the hearth charcoal, 11,542 and 11,590 years, agree with each other almost exactly, sealed under nearly 30 feet of undisturbed floodplain silt. Not a redeposited scatter of points washed downstream. A sealed single-moment camp, precise enough that researchers still call Aubrey one of the oldest confirmed Clovis sites in North America. Then there's the detail that should have been a bigger red flag decades earlier. At Blackwater Draw, alongside the famous points, excavators also found beveled bone rods, tools shaped and worked at an angle, found near mammoth limb bones. For years, that detail sat quietly in site reports, treated as a footnote. Look at what those rods were actually built to do, though, and the footnote gets uncomfortable. Beveled rods like these work as pry bars, tools used to separate joints and dismember a carcass that has already gone stiff. Not weapons. Butchering tools deployed after the kill or after a death that had nothing to do with a hunt at all. And underneath all of it sits a detail that changes how you read every single one of these sites. Around the very end of the Clovis period, roughly 12,900 years ago, researcher C. Vance Haynes documented something he called the Clovis drought, geological and paleohydrological evidence for a sharp dry spell across North America, right before the mysterious black mat layer that marks the end of Clovis culture and, not coincidentally, the extinction of most of the continent's megafauna. If mammoths were already dying of thirst and stress at shrinking water holes during exactly the window Clovis people were most active, then the line between hunted and found dead nearby gets a lot harder to draw. A weakened, dehydrated animal collapsing near a drying spring doesn't need a perfect kill technique. It just needs people who are paying attention and willing to take advantage of what the drought had already done for them. That's the moment the accepted story starts to wobble. Not because anyone's claiming Clovis people were harmless, because the physical evidence keeps suggesting something messier and more opportunistic than the clean, cinematic image of a hunter driving a spear into a charging mammoth. And if the killing technique itself is in doubt, then the entire foundation under Clovis mammoth hunter needs to be tested directly, which is exactly what happened. For most of the last century, nobody actually tested whether a Clovis point could kill a mammoth. Researchers assumed it because the points were found near the bones and because the story was compelling enough that nobody felt the need to check. In 2021, that changed. Archaeologist Meaton Aaron, working with colleague Michelle Beber at Kent State, ran a series of controlled experiments, firing replica Clovis points at ballistic gel and animal tissue analogs to measure exactly how deep they actually penetrated. The results were not what the traditional story predicted. Their setup wasn't guesswork. Replica points were hafted onto shafts built to Clovis specifications, launched at ballistic gel calibrated to mimic muscle and hide, then measured, hit by hit, for exactly how far the stone traveled before it stopped. Average penetration came in around 18.5 centimeters. The single deepest hit in the entire experiment barely cleared 28.5. To put that in perspective, a Columbian mammoth's vital organs sit under a hide and fat layer that can run well past that depth in places. Aaron's conclusion was blunt. Clovis points, he argued, were more likely functioning as cutting tools for butchering and scavenging carcasses than as weapons capable of reliably killing an animal that size. That should have ended the debate one way or the other. It didn't. A year later, a different team pushed back hard. David Kilby at Texas State University, working with Vance Haynes and several other researchers, ran their own version of the experiment, this time using a thrusting technique rather than a thrown one, bracing the spear and driving it forward with the hunter's own body weight behind it. Across 210 separate test shots, they reported that every single one reached what they calculated as lethal penetration depth for a mammoth. Same weapon, different technique, completely different result. Aaron's team responded again in 2022, defending their original numbers and questioning whether the thrusting method matched what the archaeological record actually showed. The argument has never fully resolved. What it did do publicly and permanently is destroy the idea that the Clovis point as mammoth killer was ever settled science. It was always an assumption dressed up as a conclusion. Then, in 2024, a study published in PLOS 1 offered something closer to a middle answer, and it came from an unexpected angle: engineering. Researchers Byram, Lightfoot, and Sunseri tested Clovis points and their foreshafts under braced weapon compression, essentially recreating a planted pike technique, where the hunter doesn't throw or thrust the spear at all. Instead, the butt of the weapon is braced against the ground or a hunter's body, angled upward, and the animal itself drives the point in through its own charging weight and momentum. Under that configuration, the fluted Clovis point behaved almost like a modern hollow point bullet, the researchers wrote, designed to fracture and expand on impact rather than simply puncture. It's a stranger, more dangerous technique than the classic image of a hunter throwing a spear from a distance. It requires standing your ground while 8 tons of enraged animal closes the distance, using the mammoth's own charge as the killing force. If that's closer to what actually happened, Clovis hunter doesn't mean brave marksman from a safe range. It means something closer to a person willing to stand still in front of a charging mammoth and let the animal do the work. And then came the detail that pulled the rug out from under an entirely different assumption. For generations, popular imagination has paired Clovis hunters with the atlatl, the spear thrower, a lever device that lets a hunter launch a dart with far more force and range than an arm alone could manage. It shows up in documentaries, museum dioramas, reconstructed hunting scenes everywhere. In 2026, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led again by Aaron alongside Beber, Walker, Johnson, and Buchanan, modeled the earliest reliable evidence for atlatl use across the Americas. Their conclusion: Clovis atlatl use is not supported by the archaeological record. Their modeling put the earliest confident atlatl date at roughly 9,996 years ago, nearly 3,000 years after Clovis culture had already ended. Sit with that for a second. One of the most iconic tools associated with Ice Age big game hunting in North America may not have existed yet when Clovis people were supposedly using it to bring down mammoths. Not disproven entirely. The researchers themselves note the archaeological record for early weapon technology is thin and easy to misread. But the confident textbook image, spear thrower in hand, mammoth in the crosshairs, has lost its foundation twice now. First, the point may not have killed cleanly at range. Now the weapon that was supposed to launch it might not have even existed yet. So if the classic hunting scene doesn't hold up, does that mean the Clovis mammoth hunter story is simply wrong? That's where the evidence takes its sharpest turn, because two very different lines of science run years apart, both point in the opposite direction. In December 2024, a team led by James Chatters, along with Ben Potter, Stuart Fatal, Juliet Morrow, Joan Jass, and Matthew Wooler, published Isotope Analysis and Science Advances that approach the question from an entirely different angle. Not weapons, but diet. Isotope signatures locked into ancient bone and tissue record what an individual actually ate over a lifetime, the same way tree rings record rainfall. Their analysis found that mammoth made up roughly 40% of the diet of one Clovis-era individual's nursing mother, an extraordinarily high proportion for a single species. For comparison, the closest dietary match among known predators wasn't a wolf or a bear. It was the scimitar cat, an extinct Ice Age predator that specialized almost exclusively in hunting mammoths. Whatever technique Clovis people were actually using, chemically, in their bodies, they were eating like mammoth specialists, not opportunistic scavengers, picking at whatever carcasses happened to turn up. That result held up when researchers widened the lens. In July 2026, Potter and Chatters led a hemisphere-wide synthesis, also in Science Advances, pulling together isotope and dietary evidence from 50 sites stretching from Alaska down through South America. The pattern repeated across the continent. Early peoples in the Americas, again and again, showed a heavy dietary reliance on the largest herbivores available to them, wherever they lived. Not a Texas coincidence. A continental pattern. That continental scale matters because it undercuts a quieter assumption sitting underneath this whole debate. The idea that Clovis technology and Clovis diet should look the same everywhere it appears, following one tidy migration map down from the north. 50 sites, from Alaska to South America, do not all sit on the same river, in the same climate, hunting the same herds. If the dietary signature holds that consistently across that much geography, the mammoth specialist identity wasn't a local Texas habit shaped by one drought-prone landscape. It was something closer to a shared strategy carried by people who kept encountering the same opportunity, wherever the biggest, slowest-moving prey happened to be struggling. That is the reversal this story has been building toward. The tools, tested individually, complicate the hunter myth almost past recognition. The point might not stab deep enough. The atlatl might not have existed yet. But the chemistry, locked directly into bone, says these people ate enormous amounts of megafauna anyway. Both things are true at once, and neither cancels the other out. The likeliest explanation braids them together: close-range, braced weapon ambushes at exactly the kind of shrinking, drought-stressed water holes this story opened with, combined with aggressive, opportunistic scavenging of animals that were already dying from thirst, disease, or the stress of a drying landscape, not the clean spear-throwing hunter of the textbook illustration. Something closer to a population that understood with brutal precision exactly where and when a mammoth was most vulnerable and exploited every version of that vulnerability available to them. That's not a smaller story than the myth. It's a harder one. It also reopens one of the oldest and most uncomfortable debates in North American archaeology. What actually killed off the mammoths, the mastodons, the giant sloths, and the rest of the Ice Age megafauna, all within a few thousand years of Clovis culture spreading across the continent. In the 1960s, geoscientist Paul Martin proposed what's become known as the overkill hypothesis, that human hunters, arriving in a landscape full of animals with no evolved fear of people, drove dozens of species to extinction through sheer hunting pressure. Researcher Gary Haynes has defended versions of that theory for decades, but others, David Meltzer prominent among them, have argued the timeline and the evidence don't cleanly support hunting alone as the cause, pointing instead to the same climate stress, drought, and habitat collapse that shows up again and again in the Texas record. Neither side has won outright. What this investigation adds to that older argument is a third possibility that doesn't require picking a side. A drought-weakened megafauna population, already collapsing under climate pressure, meeting a human population that had just learned exactly how and where to strike. Not simple overkill, not simple climate collapse, a convergence. Picture it the way the evidence actually suggests it happened, rather than the way a museum diorama usually stages it. Not a lone hunter stalking a healthy bull mammoth across open grassland, a shrinking waterhole in a drought-stressed landscape, animals gathering because there's nowhere else left to drink, some of them already weakened, already dying slowly on their feet. People who had learned, generation after generation, exactly which animals in that gathering were vulnerable, and exactly how close they needed to stand to finish the job with a braced point instead of a thrown one. Less a hunt in the cinematic sense, more an ambush built entirely around reading a dying landscape correctly. That convergence still has consequences today, and they don't stay confined to laboratories and journal articles. Roughly 70 miles from Waco, near Florence, Texas, the Gault site sits at the center of a very different kind of drama, one about who gets to hold the evidence at all. For years, Gault was treated less like a scientific resource and more like a private quarry, with pay-to-dig operations letting visitors pull artifacts out of the ground for a fee, no documentation, no context preserved, evidence scattered into private collections faster than researchers could study it. In 2007, archaeologist Michael Collins made a decision most researchers never get the resources to make. He personally purchased the roughly 30-acre site to stop the digging, then donated it to the Archaeological Conservancy and founded the Gault School of Archaeological Research to excavate it properly. The numbers since then are staggering. An estimated 2.6 million artifacts recovered from an excavated area that still represents only about 3% of the site's full footprint. A 2024 documentary, The Stones Are Speaking, told that preservation story to festival audiences, walking away with an audience award. Gault isn't just a Clovis site anymore. It's a case study in what almost got lost before anyone understood what they were looking at. Every one of these fights, over penetration depth, over atlatl timelines, over who owns 30 acres of Texas dirt, comes back to the same uncomfortable question. Who benefits if the old story stays untouched? A tidy, heroic image of a spear-wielding hunter is easier to put on a museum label than a messier picture involving scavenging, opportunism, and animals dying slowly of thirst. Universities have built careers and reputations on one interpretation or the other. Private collectors profited for years from a pay-to-dig system that had no interest in complicating the narrative, only in selling pieces of it. None of that makes the science dishonest. It makes it human, built inside institutions that have their own reasons to prefer a simple answer over a true one. And Gault sits at the center of an even older fight. Beneath the Clovis layer at Gault, and at the nearby Deborah L. Friedkin site, researcher Michael Waters and colleagues identified what they called the Buttermilk Creek Complex, a set of tools dated using optically stimulated luminescence to somewhere between 13,200 and 15,500 years old, published in the journal Science in 2011, older than Clovis, meaning, if the dates hold, people were in Texas before the culture that supposedly defined the first Americans ever existed. That claim didn't go unchallenged. A 2012 rebuttal led by Juliette Morrow questioned the dating and the artifact interpretations directly, arguing the case for genuine pre-Clovis occupation wasn't as airtight as it looked. The fight over Clovis, first versus someone was here earlier, has been one of the longest-running, most personal disputes in American archaeology. Careers built and challenged on which side of that line a given site falls on. Gault sits directly in the crossfire, its very existence a threat to the old orthodoxy every time a new layer gets dated. Not every Texas Clovis site tells a story this contested. Along the Gulf Coast, McFadden Beach has produced more Clovis points than any other county in the state, but not because it was a hunting ground, people return to again and again. Researchers Meltzer and Bever traced the material back to ancient land, now submerged beneath the Gulf of Mexico, that eroded and redeposited its artifacts onto the modern shoreline over thousands of years. It's not a kill site or a campsite at all, in any direct sense. It's a scattered echo of a landscape that doesn't exist anymore, washed up piece by piece onto a beach that didn't exist when the tools were made. Even the coastline itself has changed shape since Clovis people last stood on it. Which brings this story back to where it started, and to the pattern that's been running underneath every single site in this investigation. Waco's mammoths surfaced because of a 1978 drought. Louisville's questionable dates surfaced, and then got corrected, thanks to the same dry years. Aubrey survived only because Farron caught it in time. Lubbock Lake's decades of careful excavation exist because yellowhouse draw keeps eroding, layer by layer, exposing a little more of an 11,000-year record each time. Every major piece of evidence in this entire story came from the same source: water leaving or water cutting through ground that had kept its secrets for millennia. The same mechanism keeps working on material that has nothing to do with Clovis at all. The ghost towns from 2011, the dinosaur tracks from 2022. Every time the water drops low enough, Texas hands something back, sometimes 11,000 years old, sometimes 100 million. That should unsettle anyone paying attention, because it means the version of this story available right now, today, is not the final version. It's the version the current drought cycle has allowed. Somewhere along a Texas riverbed that hasn't cracked open yet, there may be a cleaner kill site waiting, or evidence that finally settles the Aaron versus Kilby argument for good, or a Buttermilk Creek layer even older than the ones already published, still sealed under sediment that simply hasn't dried out enough yet to let go of what it's hiding. The debate over how Clovis people actually killed a mammoth, whether they threw, thrust, braced, or waited for the drought to do the work for them, hasn't been settled by a single dramatic discovery. It's been chipped away at, site by site, drought by drought, the same way the mammoths themselves were, most likely taken down. Not with one clean blow, but through relentless, patient pressure, exploiting every advantage the landscape was willing to give up. Right now, somewhere outside Waco, that mammoth shelter sits, climate-controlled and quiet, tusks curled exactly as they were found, a monument to an event that had nothing to do with the story most visitors assume they're seeing. Most walk past the display case reading a short paragraph about Ice Age Texas, nod at the word mammoth, and move on, never noticing that the label doesn't explain the flood, doesn't mention the drought that uncovered it, doesn't say anything about a hunting technique the science still can't fully agree on. It doesn't lie. It just leaves out the part that's still being fought over in journals most visitors will never read. And somewhere else, along 100 smaller Texas creeks and draws that no researcher has walked yet, the next drought is already doing its work underground, drawing silt loose from bone, minute by minute, waiting for the water to drop just low enough for someone to notice a shape in the mud that shouldn't be there. Maybe it's a cleaner kill site than Miami ever was. Maybe it's a hearth older than Aubrey's. Maybe it's nothing, another flood, another false alarm like Waco. Nobody will know until the ground gives it up. When the rain finally comes back, and it always does, the river will rise, and the mud will close back over whatever it hasn't given up yet, and the ground will go quiet again, holding the rest of the answer until the next drought decides it's ready to talk. Somewhere under a Texas riverbed right now, a mammoth is still waiting to explain exactly how it died. The Clovis mammoth hunter was never a lie. It just was never the whole truth. If you want more stories where the official version cracks the moment someone actually tests it, subscribe. There's more of this coming. So tell me, knowing what the evidence actually shows now, do you think Clovis hunters were bringing mammoths down or just getting there first?